In the last several videos, we have looked at object-oriented programming. We've introduced the concept of classes and objects. We've learned how to associate data or attributes with classes and objects. We've learned how to make them have functionality or methods that allow you to manipulate that data or otherwise add interactivity and functionality to the objects. So in this video, we're going to look at a way to extend the power of your object-oriented programming by looking at what is called class inheritance. First, let's define what the word inheritance means regarding classes. It means we're deriving properties and characteristics from one class and using it and accessing it within another class. Before we get into code, let's think of a verbal example. That person class that we created in the last lesson was nice, but it wasn't very useful because if you think about humans, there's such a wide variety of traits that you could associate with a human. Not just physical characteristics, but emotional characteristics, career characteristics, educational characteristics, preferential characteristics, etc. Let's just take a very basic and bare bones example. You have this person class. You can't assign it 100 million attributes. That would be impossible, and it would probably make the computer crash and run out of memory. But what you could do is you could have something like a person class. And then on top of that person class, you could have, say, a firefighter class, an engineer class, a bus driver class, each with their own attributes and methods, but which still would contain all of the data and attributes that the person class has as well. Don't worry too much if you don't quite understand how this works. It's going to make a lot more sense once we get into code, and you're really going to see how flexible and scalable this makes classes and objects in Dart. Now we're going to move on to our software example of how inheritance works. First thing we're going to do before we actually break down what inheritance is and use it in our application, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move our person class into a new file. Now you might be saying, why is this important? While we're going to get into software design and architecture later in this series, there's a few very basic and very simple principles that you can use to make your programs easy to develop, scalable, and easy for other developers to work on. And one of them is to keep things as sequestered as possible. So you don't want one giant Dart file with 15 different classes in it, plus all your functions, all your methods, any data you might have. You want to split things up in a way that makes sense. So I've already gone ahead and done some of these steps ahead of time, but this is what we're going to do. You're going to go into your Lesson 4 OOP folder or whatever folder you're working in currently, and you're going to make a folder called classes. Now there's two ways to do this. One, you can simply go into your terminal and type make dir directory name, and obviously directory name will be the directory you want to use. Alternatively, you can right-click on any folder in VS Code and just select New Folder. Now that we have a class folder, you're going to save a file called person.dart inside of it, and you're going to cut and paste our entire person class. Now there's a few things I want you to note. First, because this is a separate file, you're going to need to re-import dart:/io, that Dart file IO library. The second is when you split something like this into a file, you want to make sure the only thing that goes in the file are things that make sense and are associated with it logically. So we're only going to put the person class in here. If we start building more classes, we're likely going to give them their own file as well. And as you can probably see on the side, a preview of our future lesson, there are other classes we're going to use. So look at how simple this makes our main Dart file. We simply have void main, and we have our data, and we have our list of data. But if you look up here, you can see that we have imported person.dart. We've imported dart.io, which we're not actually currently using in this file now, so we can remove it. And we've imported a file that we're not going to use yet, so don't worry about that. One of the things that we're going to do is create a subclass of person. So something that extends the functionality of person. And in this case, we're going to do a bodybuilder. Because as you know, a bodybuilder is a person, but it's a specific subset of people who have different interests and attributes that you might care about. So the way we do this is we're going to create a class called bodybuilder. You can see I've already done this. And it's going to have a keyword extends, and then it's going to be followed with a class that you want to extend, person. So really all this means is that the bodybuilder class will have all of the functionality of the person class in addition to all of the functionality of the bodybuilder class. You could extend the person class in nearly an infinite number of ways. You could have all the different careers. You could have people from different countries. You could have children, adults. The sky really is the limit, but the important thing is understanding that you can take a base class and extend it with functionality You can keep the things separate that make sense to be separate, but still use them together. So as with our person class, you can see that we have defined some attributes that we think most bodybuilders probably care about. We've got our bench press max, squat max, deadlift max. We've got a Boolean, remember Boolean is true false, of whether or not they're a steroid user. And then we've got their bicep size and their weight. Now here's something that you're actually going to find quite interesting. Do you remember what this is called? Take a second and think about it. If you don't, this is called the constructor. So when we are creating an instance of a class, otherwise known as an object, we have to have all the information required to construct that object. And you can see here, we have all of the items that we just created. Bench press max, squat max, deadlift max, steroid user, bicep size, weight, etc. But notice one thing. We're also having to populate all of the attributes of the person class because those are required. So when you create a bodybuilder, it's making you input the data for bodybuilder as well as the data for person. This is a design choice because every attribute we have here is required. Oftentimes though, when you're creating classes and objects, the data is not going to be required, so you won't be forced to enter everything. So if you notice in this file, we've created a bunch of methods. I want you to ignore this for now. After you've done the bodybuilder constructor, I want you to put in a closing curly brace. I want you to save the file in your classes folder and call it bodybuilder.dart. And then what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go to your main file, which in my case is called OOP3-1.dart. You can call it whatever you'd like. And make sure you're also importing classes/bodybuilder. You can see that in our list of people, I've gone ahead and added a bodybuilder object instead of just a person object. And I've defined all the attributes we need. We have the normal name, IQ, nationality, gender. You can also see there's deadlift max, bench press max, squat max, bicep size 1, weight 150. And let's set this guy to steroid user equals true. Now as a small note, we've done something fun in our bodybuilder object. If you have an inkling that any attribute is going to be true or false, or it's going to have a standard value, you can set that ahead of time. So if you'll notice, in our constructor for bodybuilder, we've set this.steroid user equal to true because, as we all know, most bodybuilders do use steroids. So we are assuming that this is going to be true. Now you can of course override this, and let's say we've got somebody who's a genetic freak of nature who does not need steroids. Well, we can go ahead and put steroid user equals false. Down below we have our normal for each loop that prints everyone out. Now let's go ahead and try and see if this works first. So we've run our application and you can see it's working. It's listing out Jason, Jeffrey, Sarah, and best people ever. It's also listing out our new bodybuilder, Chad McJohnwick, who is 22 years old. We're going to jump back to our bodybuilder class and we're going to see what sort of methods that we've assigned to it. Remember, if we don't add methods, it's just a holder for data, which is fine and useful, but a bodybuilder is more than just the size of their biceps. We have created a method called drink protein shake. Now this is really fun. If you drink a protein shake, your bench press max is going to go up by 1 pound, your squat max is going to go up by 1 pound, and your deadlift max is going to go up by 1 pound. And we've also issued a statement that says you feel the protein infuse your muscles with power. Great, every bodybuilder is drinking protein shakes all day long. So let's create one more method that playfully makes fun of bodybuilders. We're going to create a method called inject steroids. Now we want to pass through an argument with an integer that is the numbers 0, 1, 2, or 3 that is supposed to indicate how many steroids they've taken. I don't really know the volume of steroids a bodybuilder takes, but for our illustration, we're assuming 0 is none, and we're assuming that 3 is a lot. We're assuming that anything more than 3 is definitely going to kill you. So how might we do that? One way to do it would be in our inject steroids method to have a ton of if statements. If dose size equals 1, do this. Else if dose size equals 2, do this. Else if dose size equals 3, do this. Else if dose size is greater than 3, do this. That's fine, that's a great way of doing it, but since you already know how to do that, we're actually going to explore a really new piece of fun functionality called the switch statement. The switch statement is in many ways designed for scenarios just like this. The first thing we're going to do is create a string called return message. So based on which dosage of steroids they're taking, we're going to want to return different, funny, perhaps hilarious text. We don't need to assign a value here since we're going to assign that later in our program. You create a switch statement by typing out the keyword switch. You pass an argument, which is a variable. So in our case, this variable is an integer called dose size. And then you wrap this whole function in curly braces. Then we move on to the keyword case. So case allows us to define all the possibilities. So if you'll notice here, we have case 0, case 1, case 2, case 3, and then default. As you might have guessed, default is what will execute if any of the other cases are not true. So if in this case, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 all specified, default would be anything greater than 3. We have case 0, and then we have a colon. Then we're going to execute whatever code we want to happen whenever the 0 is selected for dose size. So in this case, we have a return message that says you retain your sanity and you choose not to use steroids. You gain 20 IQ. You lose bicep size, you lose weight, you gain IQ, and you are then set to this.steroiduser equals false. We use this inside of a class to make sure we're accessing and modifying that particular instance of that variable in that class. You'll also notice that we have used this shorthand for adding 20, the shorthand for subtracting 5, and the shorthand for subtracting 1. Again, this is the same as saying this.bicep size equals this.bicep size plus 1. Shorter, easier to read, great. So let's move on to case 1. We've changed our message to you take a small dose of steroid and get stronger, but your IQ drops. So you lose 3 IQ, you're set to steroid user, and you'll notice you really get stronger overall, which steroids do that to you. Case of 2, you take a larger dose of steroids and you gain immense power, but you get a massive IQ drop. You've lost 6 IQ points. Now I want to show you something that is true in these last 2 statements. This is the shorthand for subtracting, minus equals instead of plus equals. Now if you take a dose size of 3, you're going to get a return message that says you were strong, but you can barely think. You punch a lot of things and you're always angry. And you'll notice that we've modified all these statistics to go up much more. And then the default. You take so many steroids that you forgot how to do anything but curls. You get really strong, but your IQ just goes down to 10. So this method is a little more complicated than our previous ones, but it's something that you might see in a real application. You're going to execute different functions and modify data based on input that you're getting in most cases. And one last thing I want you to notice about this method. We're using all of the attributes from the BodyBuilder class, but if you can see, we're using this.IQ too, which comes from the person class. So not only can we access methods from the person class, but we're able to read and modify attributes as well. So I've gone ahead and created a new BodyBuilder object here so you can see how it works. You have to define the object type as normal. Previously it was person, now we're going to define this as BodyBuilder, and it's going to be named Jeffrey. Then I filled out some statistics. Age 42, IQ 250, 100% accurate by the way. Gender male, nationality USA, name, and then my bench press stats, squat stats, all of the attributes. Currently I'm not a steroid user. So then we're going to call the Jeffrey object. And as you've noticed, we're going to use our method chaining again to have Jeffrey both drink a protein shake and read a book. Let's see what happens. You feel the protein infuse your muscles with power. You read a novel and gained 1 IQ point. Great, so I've drank protein and I've executed the read a book function from the person class. So again, you can see how these things intertwine. So now I've gone ahead and I've extended this Jeffrey object to not just drink a protein shake and read a book. Now, as you can see, I've injected steroids. I have a nickname, Buff Stuff Booth. I've had a birthday, I've read a book, I've read a romance novel, and I've drank another protein shake. So let's go ahead and see how this code works. Wow, you can totally see we got the proper messages for everything. So what we've done in this lesson, we've created an entirely new object called BodyBuilder, and we've extended the functionality of person onto it. We've manipulated this BodyBuilder object and seen how it works. We've gone ahead and we've learned what the switch statement is and how it works. So please join us in the next video where we're going to learn so much more about object-oriented programming in Dart.